issues. Thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. It's wonderful to have you. And here we have our kind of second half of the Brown Bag series this spring semester. We have an exciting part 2 presentation that follows up on last semester's Brown Bag presentation. If anyone is interested in viewing that presentation also, it is available on the Alumni Association website. Their events, right? Past events, I think is the tab that it's under. So I am pleased, this is Marilyn Loyola, I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today. Dr. Gina Braun is the Education Department Chair and Director of Special Education. She graduated with her PhD in Special Education from the University of Illinois at Chicago in 2019, with her scholarship focusing on pre-service and in-service teacher preparation for both literacy development and equitable classroom practices. Dr. Braun teaches many courses for students seeking degrees in special education, including foundations, assessment, literacy methods, and social emotional learning. She is committed to finding ways to challenge current systems to create equitable opportunities for all students. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Braun. Thank you, Dr. Braun.
Thanks, Marlene. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. So some of you were here last time and you're going to see a little bit of an overlap because the presentation, we had a lot of technology issues, as that's the theme of my brown bags. But so you'll see a little bit of overlap because we didn't get to everything that I wanted to get to. We had some great discussions. So this is going to be a little interactive with discussions. Don't feel like you have to participate. You can also put things in the chat if you're munching on popcorn while I ask you to share your thoughts, or if you're just more comfortable chatting, that's fine. But I would love for us to have some reflections and discussions. Sounds good, Kristen. Have some discussions so that we can do this work together to really think about how we're going to dismantle ableism in higher ed. I'm going to share my screen and whoops, that's not what I meant to do. And go from there. Can everybody see the screen? Is that okay? So just to start off with my disclaimer, I am a special educator, as Marlene introduced me as, and the work of ableism really started and exists in the world of disability studies, but I would say that more recently special educators are in this, we're starting to become more knowledgeable and activists around ableism. And so I give all the credit to my colleagues in the world of disability studies for really getting us started in this conversation around ableism. I also want to mention that I am able-bodied and neurotypical, meaning I do not have a physical disability and I am not neurodiverse, which is the opposite of neurotypical. I have no diagnosed disabilities, either individually, self-diagnosed or diagnosed by a physician or a psychologist. However, much of the work that I draw on has been done by individuals with disabilities. And it's exciting to see that more and more of the work being done in the ableist community is in fact done by individuals with disabilities. They are the ones that are experts and they are the ones that should be leading our way in this, and then we can be there as allies and advocates. Okay, I also welcome a session invitation. This comes from some presentations I've seen in the past, one in particular on ableism. She utilized both of these as ways to sort of invite you into this engaged discussion. So stay engaged. It's okay to be uncomfortable, expect and accept non-closure, speak your truth. Take collective and individual ownership, assume best intentions, and remember there is no quick fix to this work. I'm starting us off now with a personal goal. So I recently watched a podcast and and or listen to a podcast, and they talked about when you're doing professional development, when you're doing sessions like this, it's really important to make it intentional by creating goals. And because this work is not you just coming to sit here and listen today, but really to move forward with this work on creating inclusive environments, what better to start with a goal? We will revisit the goal at the end of the session. So I would love for everyone just take like 30 seconds or a minute, stop and jot down on a sheet of paper next to you, on your phone, wherever, why are you here? And what is a personal goal you will work towards after attending this session? All right. As I said, we'll come back to this at the end after we kind of engage in discussion. Maybe you'll have an opportunity to revise your goal if that's what you would like to do, or keep it the same. Okay, so just a quick review, kind of what is ableism. So as I put up the definition that I did share last time, what comes up for you? What challenges do you have? What are some insights you might want to share? I'd love to ask for you all to sort of give me a little bit of thoughts on this definition. Last time we kind of had a good conversation around it. And for those of you that weren't here last time, I wanted to make sure we did share this again. This is the definition by Talila Lewis, an advocate and ally in the world of ableism and other anti-racism work. And it is a constantly changing and adapting definition for ableism and widely used in the community. Once you have access to the link to the presentation, you can go to Talila's website blog down here at this link as well. I'm just going to ask that everyone take a moment to kind of read it themselves. I'll read it while I read it aloud. A system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societal constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a language, appearance, religion, and or ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. Thank you to the individual who just joined. There is a glitch in the Zoom and you're here as Nicole Riley. So if you want to either introduce yourself or change your name so we know who it is, that would be lovely. Nicole just said the same thing I said out loud. So as I read that definition, what sort of came to mind? I know some of you were here, you've heard it before. What are your initial thoughts, wonderings, challenges, insights on this definition of ableism?
This is Kyle. I think for me, it's that second sentence that grabs you, because I think it's easy to think of ableism in every day as just like one in a list. There are certain kinds of isms, there's certain kinds of ways we societally, habitually, structurally oppress each other. And ableism is just one of those. But then when you start saying, well, wait a minute, there's these ideas and they're rooted together and they're all overlapping in a lot, not, rooted in anti-Blackness. And part of me wants to say like, wow, in what ways is ableism rooted in all these other serious issues? And then even as I start asking, I start thinking, oh yeah, I guess it is. I guess it is. So I feel like that's the first thing where my mind kind of goes.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts? Building off Kyle.
I think a lot about what I like about this definition. I was also drawn to what Kyle had said. Can everyone hear me okay, by the way? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Was the ways that a lot of, like, it's anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, imperialism, capitalism, right? And it seems like so much of it is like this imagined ideal worker, if that makes sense, like an imagined ideal. How can we have somebody who can show up to work in the ways that our work systems demand in order to keep this tugging along, I guess, I don't know. And I think about that a lot in the ways that folks who have disabilities or neurodivergent don't meet those structures, like don't work within, like, this 9-to-5 thing doesn't work, or this like this one form of, I feel like I'm losing my words, I'm sorry, this like one type of work meetings isn't working. Like there's like a way that communication, I think, gets broke down because there's certain expectations that are not met, and then those folks are categorized as like poor workers, right? Or they're not doing enough. And then within our institutions, they're poor students, or they're not doing enough. And it's difficult. I think why attending this presentation, as I had said in the reflection I did, it's difficult. It's like, how can we dismantle ableism in the institution when it is also built on all of these things too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. Good question. That's why we're here doing this work, right, Kristen? Thank you for your thoughts. So similar to kind of what Kristen was saying and what Kyle's sort of bringing up, is that ableism, like the other isms, is rooted in like this mindset, this implicit bias of what we should be, right? And so the world was not built with people with disabilities in mind. And so, as Kristen was saying, like this workforce, what it's supposed to be, what society says is a successful or a normal life or a normal worker, doesn't fit individuals with disabilities. And so thus we are ableist. And so we really need to try and shift our thoughts, our thinking, our inclusive strategies to change, our institution, which is hard, as Kristen said. There's also this idea of like the medical model versus social model that I brought up a little last time, and I'll show you the image of that in a few minutes. And then media portrayal. And these are just a couple of things, right, that have created implicit bias towards individuals with disabilities and an ableist mindset that so many people go towards. And there's many more, but this is sort of some of the big stuff that you see across much of the literature in this work. These are the things that people are really pulling out and sort of calling focus to. And so in media portrayal, Emily Ladau in her book, Demystifying Disability, talks a lot about the disabilities in media and how oftentimes in media we see things, we either see individuals with disabilities suffering, we have pity for them, or we're made to feel bad for them, or there's something what they call inspiration porn, right? Where we're supposed to be inspired by them because they're doing these amazing things, when in fact, individuals with disabilities say, well, they're doing things that everyday people do. It just happens to be that they're doing them with a disability, so we should be inspired by them. And they don't want to be inspired by, they don't want to be, these models for inspiration because they're doing things that everyday people, typical, right, neurotypical people in society do. And that is ableist thinking when we think that way. And so lately the media has gotten better with things like, including people with disabilities into shows and different things where they're just doing what everyday people do, or allowing people with disabilities a chance to share their story, and not having able-bodied neurotypical people telling the stories and experiences of those with disabilities. As I mentioned, this was the social model versus medical model. Our old way of thinking, an old, very traditional way of thinking about a disability, is to think of it as the medical model. I do want to mention here that you'll see the alt text at the bottom. I did talk about this last time as well, that anytime I do a presentation, in order to ensure I'm making it accessible to my students, I include an alt text if there is going to be an image in there. I usually just type it up myself, though there are some websites, apps out there that'll create it for you. But this ensures that any student that has any sort of disability where they can't access the visual picture have in fact access to what is on the screen. And so the medical model is the one here on the left, and that sort of is grounded in the original thoughts around, like, we diagnose a disability, we label all the things that they struggle with, that they're challenged by, you know, they're the problem, right? They have all these problems, and because of their problems, they can't access society. The newer model that we talk about nowadays, and disability advocates and allies talk about, is the social model, where, again, going back to the idea that the world was not created with disabilities in mind. The world is the barrier to individuals with disabilities, and we need to recreate the world in order to consider these barriers ahead of time before, so that all people can access school, work, all of the above. So now we have like this broad understanding sort of ableism. What is ableism like in higher education? We are an institution where, you know, historically it is a very ableist institution. I talked about it last time, you know, this idea that Jay Dolmage brings it up in his book, Academic Ableism, the idea of climbing the ivory tower. We know that the ivory tower is only accessible to certain individuals that don't fit any of the isms typically, right? And so that includes obviously people with disabilities. And I want to mention here too, before I move on, that in the literature and the work that's out there around kind of dismantling ableism in higher ed and supporting students with disabilities, or supporting disabilities in higher ed institution, there is quite a bit now on supporting students with disabilities. What there isn't as much of is how we are creating institutions that allow faculty and staff with disabilities to successfully participate and work in higher ed. There is definitely not as much out there on that. They call that out, but there isn't a lot of work of like, what are we doing to ensure that higher ed institutions are welcoming and inclusive environments for those who work there as well. I shared this in these stats with you all last time, but just, you know, to reshare those. So to give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on in higher ed, 13% of individuals with disabilities have a bachelor's, compared to 31% of those without disabilities. Only 2/3 of individuals with disabilities are unable to complete their degrees. Going off of what I said about faculty and staff with disabilities, only 3% of tenure track professors across the country have disabilities. And so a lot of individuals with disabilities, PhDs, doctorates with disabilities, end up getting hired as lecturers and adjuncts and less as tenure track professors. And of course, kind of what the definition gives us an insight into is that there is definitely intersectionality of disability and other oppressed groups that must be named here and mentioned, because that adds layers of oppression and challenges with the institution. Another slide here to give you some information around disabilities, and I'm going to ask you to think about something here that we're going to revisit later. So if you look at this chart, this is from 2018-2019 of undergrad students in the United States. 81% are non-disabled, neurotypical, and around 20% of students with disabilities. And then the little box kind of gives you the breakdown of disabilities across the different areas. What's interesting here is that 20% of students have disabilities, yet the national average for K to 12 is only about 10 to 12%. So it significantly increases when you get to higher ed. And my thoughts around that, this is kind of just me thinking about what I know about who qualifies for disabilities in K to 12 versus who qualifies for disabilities and supports in higher ed. I'm thinking more like psychiatric disabilities, health or chronic, and even maybe mobility. You see a lot more learning disabilities, ADHD, things like that in the K to 12. So I guess good news is that students are seeking out disability supports when they're getting to higher ed that didn't have it necessarily in K to 12. But here's what I want you to think about now and hold on to that for later. 20% of students in undergrad have disabilities. I want you to think about your undergrad classes right now. Do you think, would you say that of your classes, 20% seek accommodations? Are 20% of your students, are you getting 20% like letters, accommodation letters from your students? Would you say that? Kyle says no, no, nope. Now, it would be interesting to know the percentage of disabilities at Rockford University, which I don't have. But if we think about 20% have disabilities. Okay, so we have a lot of no's. Like, let's hold on to that for later and think about that.
Gina, I have a question about that. I feel like a lot of students, or there may be in that percentage, students who don't know that they have a learning disability, for example, or don't know that they have ADHD.
So now the stats are based on documented disabilities.
Documented,
so
okay.
People know they, right, the data,
Yeah.
those people know they have it. So that's a great point, because now we're also thinking about the percentage of students who are going without a diagnosis of a disability.
Right, because I have had cases of students that, because of the types of challenges they face in a classroom, might come to the realization that there might be something else going on, but that's after almost 20 years of living with the same challenges, probably, right? That maybe it's worth talking to someone, you know, in Lang, just to have a conversation about it. So I wonder if something about college work and, you know, something about the attention that they might get at the college level might make them actually think a little bit differently about it. Anyway, I don't know if that adds anything to that, but I feel like that's, my experience is more with that sometimes.
I think that's a really good point. And I think that's something to think about in the sense of, if they're struggling now with things in the college classroom, the university classroom, could they possibly struggle with things out in the professional world? And if that's possible, we need to help them understand that now and seek out services and help them become advocates so that they can become successful in the world, you know? And again, as Kristen said earlier, the system out there in the professional world is not built for people with disabilities, but what we can do is educate and support and help students become advocates so they can get the supports they need. And if they qualify for services under ADA, they can have those through their work life, right? Like they can use that in their professional settings. So while we have them, let's give them the power to recognize their needs and advocate for the supports that they deserve. Let's look at a couple of examples here. While we look at these these are going to be examples of ableist experiences of students. So the Cornell, gosh, I'm totally drawing a blank on what it's the newspaper in Cornell. I'm totally drawing a blank on what it's called. They did an article and interviewed students who have disabilities who had experience with ableism in their classrooms. And now I keep saying classrooms because we're all, you know, we're sort of individuals here that teach. Most of us are individuals that teach, but this is not just the classroom, right? This goes beyond. This is university-wide. This is all systems within our university that we really should be thinking about. But in particular, these examples are things that happened in a classroom. So while you review the scenario, think, why is this ableist? Who is responsible? And what would you do if you knew that this was your student? So she walked into the classroom prepared to take her exam when she noticed the chair behind her desk was not conducive to her scoliosis. Sitting in a chair for a long period of time hurts her back, so she requested a different one. She kept her head down to avoid any unwanted attention, but her classmate began to comment. I don't want people to come up and ask anything. And lo and behold, I get people coming up and saying, oh, look at you and your special privileges, said Nicole. I'm not going to even try to pronounce her last name and get it wrong. I'm about to take a test. I don't need to be disclosing about my disability. So imagine like that first half is she doesn't even want to request the special seating. The second half is when she has it. Look what happens when she has it. So why is this ableist? Who is responsible for this? And what would you do if you knew this was your student? How could we avoid this?
Does the professor know?
Great question.
Because as a professor, I would hope I would know that there's some sort of issue. And I may try to I may have thought about it ahead of time. I feel bad for this situation because I agree. I'm sure she has to have something there.
Mm-hmm. Kirsten?
I would have, and I've been trying to do this better or be better about it. It's hard. I would have liked to have a conversation with the student before it came to this point. Like I would have been like, okay, if there is this accommodation, how would you like this worked through in the classroom to see how they would like that communicated to others, if at all, and in what kind of ways they would want it communicated to others. So having an individual conversation so that that person has some agency in how this comes out and can determine when too, which seems like this is what was especially problematic about this example was the timing of it all.
Yeah, it's like there's the problem with chair and there's the problem with how people talk about it. And they're related, and when they talk about it. But it's like, yeah, there's the issue of trying to make things as smooth as possible beforehand so it doesn't come up. But then it's like when and if it does, how do you handle that? How do you shut everyone else down in a way that protects her? But then that just makes it a bigger deal. Yeah, it's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely agree. I think that it's having the conversation ahead of time, and then not making an issue, but allowing or figuring out a way and asking her what would she like to help support her.
Mm-hmm. And the situation here may not have been the professor, right? It's the students. Well, we can assume that the students are the ones that are sort of giving her making these comments, right? That, oh, she gets special privileges. And so, to what some of you said, like, how do we create an environment where students don't, understand that it's not appropriate to have those, to say those things, to have those things, right? The students have an ableist mind where they think it's okay to make those comments and that they won't be, that Nicole wouldn't be offended. Let's look at another example.
Just really quickly, I don't think that the students making the comments think that she's not going to be offended. I think that's their purpose. I think that's an intentionally insulting and disrespectful comment. Where it comes from is certainly ableist, but there's a lot of other stuff that could go into that kind of comment. Who knows? That could be the institution. I'm not sure.
And this is, I mean, these are real lived experiences that students are going through. So I meant, you know, it's unfortunate.
And I think those institutions often like will give professors like some kind of, maybe not exactly a template or a series of this is what you do, but in these cases, like I worked at an institution when I was a graduate student where they had the what was it, McBurney program, where students had a visa, and on the first day of class you were to say, if anyone has a visa, come and talk to me. So there you never mentioned anything about what a visa was necessarily, but they, you know, the institution gave you like, this is what you say on the first day of class, and this is how you can deal with this, and this is, you know, we don't get that here at RU, but I think that could help in terms of, you know, what students might feel on the other end, or how they perceive this kind of standard way of dealing with accommodations on the institution's end. I mean, I don't know.
Interesting thought. Yeah. Okay. Speaking candidly, ableism is something I experience quite frequently, he said. I personally receive extended time for exams as one of my accommodations. And I've had some faculty who have said things like, do you really need that? Or maybe you'll get a higher score because you've had more time. I had people who have said things like, are you trying to game the system? So who's responsible for that? And how do we change, you know, what would you do? None of you would say that, I know, but that's why you're here. But what do we do if we know colleagues are acting like that, right? Have some of this ableist thoughts, or students have said that they've come up, you know, that their professors have made them feel this way.
I think this is more of a rambling than necessarily an answer to your question, but some things that I kind of think about is, would the answer be different if I were tenure already and versus on tenure and trying to figure out the institution still in the process of that, right? I haven't heard this particular account at RU, but students talk, right? And when you listen and give them space to listen, you know that things like this are happening at RU. And I never know what to do outside of attend the anti-racist meetings, right? Go to presentations like this, try to talk to people in power to see if we can get more faculty training so that things like this don't happen and end up inadvertently harming our students in some way. But I don't know. I don't think there's a necessarily an easy answer to it, because obviously there's going to be people who care and want to learn and grow, and there's going to be people who don't have the space for that in their lives for whatever reason at the moment.
Kristen, that was probably the kindest thing to say. I think you did such a nice job of saying that. I probably would be like, that is so rude what you said to that person, you know? and I agree with the issue of, without tenure, sometimes you're more cautious on what we say to people. Sorry, I'm outside in the wind.
It sounds wonderful. You must be enjoying the nice weather. I think you're right. It's trickier when you're not tenured versus when you're tenured, and how you go about doing this work.
There's a fundamental misunderstanding of what accommodations are and how they work here. So it's like Kristen was saying about like educating ourselves. Like how do we need to educate people so they see, like, I guess I don't really know what we get or how we get it, or, you know, what's communicated in what way, but like if you really think that, if you really think someone's trying to game the system, you're suggesting that Lang has either been given wrong data or they're taking documentation and using it inappropriately. It's like, I don't know.
Well, and because the student does well on a test, because they have the accommodation, a faculty member might be like, oh, well, they did well on that. They probably didn't need the accommodation. But in fact, the accommodation is why they were able to access the assessment at the way in which they were supposed to. I think you're right, Kyle, that there's a misunderstanding of what an accommodation, the purpose of it really is.
It sounds like it's deeper than that. It's more relational, and if we don't have trust in creating these relationships, for example, I just think about what you just said, Kyle, when you said that, do the people that are saying this, do they not believe Lang? Well, it's sort of our job to believe Lang. We put that in their hands, and so if we don't have trust, we're not creating relationships, and we're not creating relationships with the people who need us to be in these relationships the most, which are our students or the people that have some sort of need assistance or need accommodation.
Can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm a little late if you covered this, that might be a repetition, but so do you have any data if we have this problem more on higher education versus like high school or middle school setting? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think to break
Or
down,
are you generally talking about higher education?
yeah, we're talking specifically about higher ed here, but it's a really good question. I think there is so it brings up a point I'm going to talk about later, which like oftentimes accommodations, especially in higher ed, are thought of as a compliance checker and not actually as sort of something that students really need support with. And that is often the case in K-12 as well. Like if a student qualifies for a disability, they get an accommodation, and there are teachers out there who feel like they don't need it, or they don't do it, or they don't have the resources for it. So it's kind of a big question with there's a lot to get that data. It would be a really interesting data to collect. I mean, you'd have to look across multiple situations, right? General ed teachers versus special ed teachers. There's just a lot. It's a big question, Orhan.
Okay.
Get to my point. But yeah, really good thinking. And I guess in short, to answer your question, yes, the same thing will happen in K-12.
That was the question. So
yeah, in my experience, but I don't have data.
It is more or less the same, or do you think that one of them is the problem is higher in, I don't know, K-12 versus higher education? I'm asking your opinion.
I would say it's probably pretty similar, but again, I think it's different. Like special educator, I want to say that special educators in K-12 would be more willing and more understanding of accommodations, but that's not also necessarily the case. So it's really hard for me to answer that question.
Okay.
Do you know that it exists in K-12 as well? Okay, so how does ableism manifest in higher ed? We've kind of seen a couple of examples, but I wanted to just open this up to more discussion. I said earlier that this is something that we're talking about within courses as faculty members, like what are some things we can be doing and thinking about or seeing in our own courses, but also broader across the university. So I put a couple of thoughts down here that are really sort of things that pop up in higher ed that create ableism, that stop individuals from being able to access, successfully access school, successfully access higher education and seek their degrees. Things like attendance policies and penalizing absences. You hear a lot about that in the mental health community. Specific types of testing, grading, requiring things like eye contact, sort of like having that like white power sort of mentality of like, this is how you're supposed to be a professional, this is what you're supposed to do, goes along with that. Requiring, another smaller example, requiring cameras on for virtual classrooms, things like that. Just a couple of examples. What other examples do you feel like you've seen, you've heard, you've experienced that we can continue to add to a list like this?
I think just the timing, I always wonder about the timing of classes. You get 10 minutes in between classes, right? And so if one professor doesn't get out of class in a timely manner to get across campus within the 10 minutes, I think like if you're coming from Puri, that's a half a mile. Not that you can't do a half a mile, but to go there to Seaver, or even from Star and Star getting across. So I think that time itself causes ableism, or the like, and I know I probably am bad at this. I'll say, okay, you're on time if you're 10 minutes early, you're late if you're on time, but then I'll say to everyone, listen, if you've got a class somewhere on campus, you just need to communicate. However you communicate, that's so I think time is an issue.
A great point. Great one.
I could add requiring participation in a very a rigid way, like being like, you need to talk during class, or you need to participate in small groups in this way. Especially if a student has certain social anxieties or disabilities that make it difficult to kind of talk out loud in groups. So giving opportunities for participation that aren't necessarily dependent on verbal communication, I think is something you could do to kind of avoid that.
I love it. And the reason I'm starting this list is because sometimes we feel like this task is impossible, but we can start with these small things, right? And that's why I wanted to call our attention to a list of items such as this. Are there any other thoughts? I like the two we've got so far.
I guess I'm thinking of like, I've not really done this, but how do you make it clear that students can use the space in a way they want to use the space? That if they want to knit or fidget with something, or sit in a non-traditional chair or sit in a non-traditional way, how do you just say it like, hey, just so you know, like, we can use the space how you need to use it.
Yeah, I love that, Kyle.
I think some of that has to do with the like the furniture. I was reading one research study, and it talked about in some of the classrooms, in order to create like a more community where you're comfortable, the furniture can't look like table chair, table chair, table chair. It needs to look like little angle tables or something, so they can choose in a small community.
Kristen, do you know, have you seen Maggie Price's, doesn't she have a, like, what she says at the beginning of conference presentations, kind of an invitation to use spaces and however you want.
That's a great one, Kyle.
Can't find it, but it's there somewhere.
Tell me what it is, or send it to me.
Yeah, send it to us, please. And yeah, Kathy, what you're talking about is like what we call in K-12, like flexible seating, creating like really warm and cozy environments that are conducive to all learners, that, they have the choice between sitting or standing or, leaning back, or however it's going to work for them. And it's like a student with the scoliosis example above, if the chairs were just variety in the space, they wouldn't be the one student with the special chair, right? It would just be an environment where chairs like that she needs are accessible and are of the norm.
Well, and those are like simple rectify, simple ways to rectify a situation. And and obviously on a higher education campus, you have to decide whether you're going to spend your money on that. You know, are you going to spend money to make an environmentally friendly community in the classroom, or do you start with one classroom at a time, or what does that look like? I mean, and I get it, we're all getting furniture, for example, from everybody else's used furniture to try to make do. Once somebody gets brand new, then you get their leftovers.
Well, and that's exactly the point of like this presentation, right? That again, going back to what I said originally, that the world and higher ed institutions were not created with people with disabilities in mind. So they didn't create classrooms with all of these varied seating options, right? So now it's okay, does the university spend the money on disabilities to accommodate the 20%? Right? That's the pushback that people will get. Well, it's only 20%. We're not going to change this for 20%, but that's ableist thinking. And that's what we're trying to sort of really push for. It's not going to just help the 20%. It's going to help everyone. And it's going, you know, and that's the idea behind this work. And so, yeah, I'm so glad you just brought that up. And Kyle just shared in the chat the Maggie Price's access. So looking at the time, I'm just going to keep us moving a little bit, but we can keep talking. So what can you do? So that you're all sort of getting to this already, which is exciting. So things like universal design for learning, creating spaces and programs that teach to all students, right? That create environments and create curriculum that support all students. And creating a welcoming and safe space for all individuals with disabilities, a culture of inclusion. So thinking about what Kyle was saying, can I just say, like, use this space as you need it? Yeah. Like maybe have that on your first of every slide until students really start to understand and accept that it is okay to do that. Put language in your syllabi that talk about that it's okay to use your space. Going back to what Kristen said about participating in varied ways. I do have comments and phrases in my syllabi that says, I am giving some, I am not grading, but I am like looking and checking out for participation, but participation looks very different. It's not, you're the one that raises your hand every day in class, right? Participation comes in varied ways. Understand your students' learning profiles. That's just not like the traditional, are they visual or kinesthetic learners or auditory learners, but their styles, right? Do they like to knit during class? Does that help them stay focused, right? What are their preferences, their experiences? How can you play into that to create environments that are inclusive? I like to put thinking outside of the accommodation box. So I said it earlier, and I'm going to talk about it again. Accommodations are often used in higher ed institutions as a checkbox for compliance. The student has a disability, they register with the health center, they get under ADA by law, they have to have this accommodation. We get a letter in our email saying these are the accommodations, and we do our best to accommodate them. That's just within the accommodation box. Students can have accommodations without having a legal piece of paper that says it. Though to Marlene's point earlier, I think it's really important to help students recognize their needs without having diagnosed disabilities and advocate for those legal documents, but you can accommodate anyone for any reason. Kyle's student that loves to knit doesn't have a disability that says they love to knit, right? That they needed that accommodation. That's just something he's willing to do to create an inclusive space where they can sort of stay focused on learning. And remove, like, if you can in your syllabi, make it very clear that you want to remove any harmful language. So you can usually have this in a blurb under discussions or expectations or policies. That's where I put it. When we are having discussions in classrooms, when we are talking to our peers, we are removing harmful language. And I give examples of harmful language that we should no longer be using. Anything related to those isms, not just disabilities and ableism. And find out as I talked about earlier with media, we need to move towards this idea that disabilities is not something that is bad. To have a disability is not bad. To have a disability, we shouldn't pity people with disabilities. They're not suffering, right? They are living their lives that looks different from society, what society says is normal. And we need to normalize disabilities as higher ed faculty, as staff and faculty in higher ed institutions. And by doing that, something as simple as bringing in literature and various perspectives of individuals with disabilities from your perspective fields, right? Find out individuals with disabilities who are doing great work in your field and bring it in and call it out and share, that people with disabilities are doing great work, and not as inspiration, but just as regular people too, right? And when you can, I don't know if you all do this, but I really recommend when you do get that letter from Lang that has a list of accommodations, I recommend you sitting down with that student and having them unpack their accommodations with you. Oftentimes it's an overwhelming experience where they submit a document and then what comes back to them is a list of accommodations that they're qualified for, or that Lang might work, or certain institutions might work with them to choose their accommodations. But students don't really know, not all students really know what accommodations they qualify to have and all of that. So, and they don't really know what that means. So sit down with them and help them craft a personalized learning experience for your setting and what that might look like. Remember, more accommodations are more than compliant. We should be using accommodations as a way to retain students and create inclusive environments. And this is just, I put this up here as like a form. So I told you earlier to think about, you have 20% of students with disabilities in the United States are identified in undergrad. And I asked you if 20% of students are qualifying for these accommodations. And all of you said, no, no way, right? So what does that mean? Students are not going they're either not submitting their disabilities, or they're not sharing it with you, which I guess Lang would share that directly with you. This means is that students with disabilities are not going to Lang, and they're not requesting the accommodations. And that is very much because it is seen as a negative stigma. It is seen, the examples that we saw above that students are experiencing. They don't want mumblings under their breath from their peers and from faculty members. They would rather just not ask for the services because they don't want pushback or to be bullied by individuals. And so we want to make sure we give students a comfortable space where they know it is okay to ask for accommodations. This is that reminder here. I put this up from last time, the do's and don'ts of disabilities. And I know looking at the time, we've got 1 minute left. So just a reminder, right? When you leave here today, remember to normalize disabilities and consider ways in which you can create safe and inclusive environments. So let's revisit our goals before we go. You came in an hour ago and you wrote down, why are you here? And what is a personal goal you will work towards after attending this session? So look at your goals. Does anybody want to revisit it? Does anybody want to share their goal before we head out?
I have a thought, and it's kind of tied to my goal. My goal is to get better at, sorry, there's a teenager on a dirt bike leaving my house. But to get better at accommodating the possibility of having students in a classroom that may never identify their disability, right? So this is consistent with my comment from before, but then there's something really powerful that came to mind, which is that a few years ago we had a physically disabled student who was a Spanish major and a physics minor. And she ended up doing some work. I forget if she published anything on this, but on the idea that physical accommodations are beneficial for everyone, not just disabled people, right? In her case, you know, her one big example were like the on-ramps on a sidewalk, right? The ADA updates and things like that, that benefits anyone with a stroller. It benefits anyone who, you know, who walks with a, you know, a walking helper, right? With tires on it or whatever, right? So that idea of taken to things that are less tangible, right? That you may not know, or maybe just in your classroom policies, is a really powerful, I feel like it could be potentially very powerful to think about, like what accommodations might you make for students whom you think have a disability, or, you know, may have some challenges that you can work with, whether they're identified or not. How can those accommodations actually benefit everyone? How do they? And I don't know if that's an ableist thought or just an idea that there is no real difference here, that these accommodations are this part of this like new society that you're kind of indirectly talking about, right? Or talking about here. I don't know if that's a
yeah, I mean, you're
misguided
talking
thought.
like, you're talking UDL really, right? Creating these spaces and programs that will work for everyone.
I don't know what UDL is.
Oh, Universal Design for Learning.
Okay. I don't know what that is, but sounds
Oh,
good.
another day, another session for another time.
You know, I think about when I try to explain to students about, imagine someone having a disability. If someone has cancer, or they've, because of diabetes, they lost the ability to, or they lost part of their toes. Does that mean that they don't live a healthy, well life? And so we break it down into that and say, you know what, I mean, the old medical model, that's what you said. That's the way it was. You were a sick role. But the new best model, the wellness model, is that we're healthy even if we have a disability. We're healthy if we have a chronic disease. We're healthy. And we need to express that everyone is, unless we don't allow them to be. If we, in our own ableism, don't allow them to be. We allow them to be different, but we don't look at it as equal.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Well, thank you all for coming today. I just want to share, I'll make sure that you guys all have the PowerPoint here, but I did share a bunch of different resources, the books that I've been reading. I recently came across the National Center for Students with Disabilities. It's a great resource to learn about how organizations across the country are supporting students with disabilities in higher ed. One in particular, they have this like a sub-partnership with this organization called the Dream Committee, and institutions can apply to have a Dream Committee on their campus, which actually creates like a club of students to support students with disabilities, to create an inclusive environment. So that's my goal, is to find out how I can create a club on campus that would have some great backing and some great resources and supports to really start moving this work along. So I'm really excited about that. And then these are in all of your free time. These are all linked, hyperlinked. That's why they're underlined. This is some of the best readings I've found with like some really great, like right there in your face, like I can go take these strategies and use them, practice them, food for thought, really great resources that have come out in the last few years around academic ableism in higher ed in particular, and just a couple of other references. So thank you so much all for coming and engaging today. Any questions before
Thank you.
Gina, I was just going to say, I'm not sure if I'm sure you've talked to Kristen Clark, or maybe Imagine talking to her about your plan, but I wondered, I was talking to Lang for an English department or RET training meeting, and they were talking about how they were going to do they wanted to do group counseling, but sometimes that was hard to do because it's easier to do when you have an existing student to work with, as opposed to just creating one from scratch. So I could see that as a potential like collaboration with Lang in the future. Having some kind of somebody who's trained to counsel it, who's also working with students, but all kind of like following their lead as opposed to the other way around. I think
love
that's
that.
really great for our campus.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thanks, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you, Gina. I hope that there's a part 1 and 2 next semester and next year.
We'll
maybe
continue
I
this
feel
work.
like this is a conversation that definitely can and should continue.
Are you going to join us, Marilyn, next year?
If you invite me.
Yes, please.
I
Yes.
hope
I will.
so. Yeah, I
I
hope
will.
so. Definitely. I would love to. But thank you all again. And have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Enjoy the
Thank
weather.
you. We'll get the recording up by tomorrow afternoon, so it'll send out to everybody. Thanks, Gina. Yeah, Nicole,
you,
I'll send you
Nicole.
the
Thank you, Gina.
presentation too, so you have that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Have a good day.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Thanks.